What if I told you that my favorite set of rules is broken, and the game is totally broken, and that's why I love the game? Stay tuned to this channel, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So here they are. These are the original rules right here. These little booklets are the booklets that launched a whole hobby industry. And then later they came out with this over here, the basic set in 1977. These little booklets kind of caught fire in people's imaginations, and they just went everywhere. And here we are 50 years later still playing elf games. I wanted to talk a little bit today about how the game is in the old rules. The game was kind of broken. There were things that weren't covered. Gary Gygax talks about that in I think, I'm not sure if it's in the introduction or maybe it's in his closing statements. Yeah, in his afterword, you know, he says there are unquestionably areas which have been glossed over. While we deeply regret the necessity, space requires that we put in the essentials only, and he goes on and talks about that. That was kind of the beauty of the game, was that it was kind of broken, and it was up to the dungeon master and the players to have this relationship of trust, which I think gets sort of diluted and maybe even lost when you have too many rules in a game. And I'm not saying you have to play the rules I use. I just happen to love using these rules. But there is a sort of magic to having a game system where you have to make judgments just on the fly, and you're sort of making rules for situations even just on the fly. Like a player wants to do something and you say, okay, I think your chances of doing that are like maybe 50%. And then they can go like, well, you know, I'm going to take off my armor and I got a really good dexterity. I should have about a 75% chance. And you negotiate it, and it's like, okay, roll your dice. Let's see what happens. And they do their little do or die roll. It's a little bit like gambling with your character to see if they succeed at doing whatever they want to do. Not long ago, I was on another YouTube show with Dunder Moose. It was Rob Kuntz, who happens to be one of the early designers of Dungeons & Dragons. He co-wrote the Greyhawk supplement with Gary Gygax and myself on the Dunder Moose show. And one of the things that struck me listening to Rob talk about his philosophy about the game was that the Dungeon Master is a game designer. And so you can take that, you can kind of look at it as like the Dungeon Master designs the adventures, so they make the maps and they populate the maps with the creatures that live there and the treasures you can find there. Or you can go a little bit deeper and you can realize that in the early days, we had a lot of situations that a dungeon master just had to come up with a rule for. And so it actually comes out of wargaming. A lot of wargames early on, you'd hit situations where there might have been a typo, or maybe they just hadn't play tested it enough to realize there was a little hole in the rules. And so you had to make up your own rule, and this came to be known as home ruling. I think it's important to home rule. I think that you can probably do it regardless of the game system you're using. There's probably something that you don't like about the game you're playing. Whatever the rule is. Maybe it's you're playing 5e and you think the death saves are too easy and you want to do something different, right? And so you can just come up with a little rule. You don't even need to write it down. You just kind of make it up in your head, and you tell your players, like, from now on, we're going to play death saves like this. And you describe it to them, and they're like, okay, that's the house rule. We can all agree on that. And you play it. What's interesting about the home rules is that over time, they're really organic, because what you're doing is you're introducing a new rule. You're not really sure if it's going to work, right? But you're going to play it, and the more you play it, the more you might be like, well, I need to adjust course. And you're going to change things a little bit. And over time, your rules will organically come to a place where they aren't necessarily, and it's not about realism. Like, these are elf games. Nothing's realistic in these games. It's about game experience and playability. And so your rules will become more playable and just more enjoyable for the players. They'll all agree that it seems fair to them if you have a rule like this. And so, yeah, I don't know. I just think that home ruling is really important. Every campaign, some people feel that rules should be played as written, the raw rules as written crowd. And I feel like every dungeon master should introduce little fiddly bits that make their campaign unique and special in their own little creation. Some of the rules I've been using in my own campaign, and I'm using this. Okay, this is actually my core rule book, and then I'm also using this, but this one really describes certain things better than this one, so I kind of combined them. But there are things in there that aren't covered well. One of the things I find really frustrating in a game, and this was, I think back, I can place myself back to being a 14-year-old playing, and I get a hit on a monster, right? Like I could roll a 20, and we didn't have critical hits back then, but I could roll a 20 to hit the thing, and then I roll my damage roll and I get a 1. And I always thought that was kind of frustrating. The other thing was the inverse of that. I get a great hit and I roll damage and I get maximum damage, let's say 8 points for a sword, and it's a 1 hit point orc. So I've wasted 7 points. So one of the things I've used in my game is spillover damage. And since I'm using the abstract game where it's not like you're just hacking on each other in front of each other, the combat is a fluid thing. Your die rolls really just represent your chance to get a coup de grace, and just like lunge and stab the guy well. And so let's say I'm going up. Well, actually, I can just describe what happened. I was still. It's always a play test when you're playing your own homebrew rules. So I was running the game last time. They were in a combat. They were about to go down these stairs in Tonisborg, and suddenly these skeletons just come pouring out of the stairs because they got a wandering monster roll. And let me see. One of the guys, I forgot who it was, but one of the characters had a two-handed sword, which does up to 12 points damage, and they rolled a 12. Well, skeletons only have up to 4 points damage, so they basically cleave through like 4 of them. And so I described how like you hack one and it just shatters and bones go flying everywhere, and another comes up to take its place, and you get that one, and just you're basically just working your way through this mass of skeletons that are rushing at you, and you're just turning them into piles of bones that are just flying everywhere. And so that was one character. Another character, I think it was Chris, he rolled his attack and he got a 1 damage, and I was like, well, you kind of hurt it, But, so you get these extremes, but at first I thought, oh, this system isn't going to work. He just killed 4 skeletons, and then I had to pause and think about it, and I was like, wait a minute. It does work, because it's creating this really dramatic event, and the damage of that, rolling that 12 on a 2 hit point skeleton would be such a disappointment, but you roll that 12, you deserve to wipe out 4 skeletons in front of you and just go mowing them down with your two-handed sword. So that's one rule I like to use. Try it out. Maybe you have something else in your head, riff off of what I'm doing and like go, oh, I kind of like that, but I do it differently because I'm playing a different system and I need to do something differently. Another one I really like is to have combats be a little bit more dynamic. Dan Boggs talked about, one of the rules that I love that he put into Tonisborg was the idea that if you're defending in a doorway, you can basically, only 2 of the enemy can get into the doorway because they're fighting you out of the doorway, but 3 of you can be on the other side fighting them, so you get that 3-2 attack. So it's in their best interest to push you back so more of their compatriots can come pushing through the doorway and they can start to engage more of the party members. There are a couple ways to do that. I like to do I just tally the number of hits. So like if the 3 players, if your side gets more hits on the opponent than their side gets on you guys, then you manage to just keep them in the doorway. If they hit, like, let's say they hit 2 of your guys and only 1 of your guys gets a hit, then they get to push you back, and maybe another guy gets to step through the doorway and engage in combat. And you kind of, you manage that in your head, you visualize it, you describe it to your players. Bigger monsters, like say you run into an ogre or even a Balrog, you're trying to fight a Balrog, well, that thing's huge. It just moves where it wants to move. And so you can describe how it's just like pushing the party back. It's just, it's got a flaming sword, it's got this whip, and it's just, your fighters are just being beaten back and everybody's retreating. That's kind of fun to use. Hallways too, stairwells, hallways. Combats in stairwells and hallways are always really fun, especially if you use knockback and forced retreats, because it means that the players are having to deal with a more complex situation than just rolling dice to see if they hit and if they do damage. It's like, oh, this thing is pushing you back down the hallway, or it's pushing you, maybe you're in a room and there's like a pit behind you, and there's like, this thing is going to try to force all of you into the pit behind you or something like that. Depends on, there's all kinds of situations you can run into. The other rule that I found useful to use in my game is I use a 0 hit point is unconscious rule, and if you get knocked down to 0, you're unconscious, you're still alive. If you get below 0, you're dying. So at the end of a battle, my clerics are trained in the healing arts, and they can bind wounds, and they have bandages that they can use with them, and so they can bind wounds, and they get a d4 of healing after the combat. So if a character's injured maybe 2 points and they roll a d4 and they get a 2, then the character's unconscious but they're still alive, and they can combine that with healing spells. That's an old rule. I'm not sure where I found it. I think it might have been in an old Judges Guild thing, unless it's in here maybe even. I'm not sure. I get rules everywhere and I get it all mixed up in my head. But those are some interesting ideas you can use to make your game more interesting, because I think there's always going to be something that you don't like in your set of rules, no matter what it is. And once you buy these games, they're yours. You can do anything you want with them. These are supposedly priceless, right? And so, I don't know if you can tell on the camera, but I got X's through the hit points because I thought it was silly. And I just wanted like 1 hit die per level instead of like 7 plus 1 or 9 plus 3. I was like, no, we're just going to do 1 hit point per level. That's just the way I'm going to do it. And I did that with pencil when I was about 15 or something like that. Another rule I always hated was like magic users may arm themselves with daggers only. That's in here. There's a pen mark through that. I put that through there not long ago, just as a demonstration to somebody else about this is my book and I get to do whatever I want with it. And there's once you start to play with the numbers and you start to get a sense for the averages of the die rolls and what the values mean, you can adjust things mathematically in sort of a logical way. Like for instance, let's say we don't want wizards to use daggers against people with swords because that just seems silly. I can't, if I have something this long and you have something this long, you're going to stab me every time and I can't stab you. Maybe the magic users only do 1 to 4 damage with it because they're not trained in using a sword. But it's more rational for them to be using a longer weapon. You can think of any number of things. Maybe they just have a minus to their attacks or something when they're using a weapon that they aren't trained in. You'll come up with something, I'm sure. Trying to think what else. I mean, that's really my thing, is like, you get your rules and you can, whatever you're playing, just think about what doesn't work for you and just change it. And if you tell your players ahead of time, I've changed this rule, I've changed that rule this time, they'll be fine with it. They'll be like, okay, that's how we're gonna play. As long as you're consistent, you have to be consistent. And then you play it for a while and they don't like it, and they'll tell you like, I don't know, I didn't like the way that worked because I felt like I got ripped off. And you're like, okay, we'll change it around. We'll change it again. My rules in my campaign are constantly changing. I've seen so many comments from the founders of the hobby, and they talk a lot about how early on especially, they were just constantly adapting their rules. They were like, yeah, use that for a while, didn't like it, now it's different. Yeah, so think about doing some home brewing. It's a natural thing. You'll kind of grow into it the more you do it. But I've got those good starters for you. The spillover damage is a great one. The knockbacks for making more dynamic fights down hallways where you're getting pushed back. And the binding of the wounds. I don't know what in original D&D, like a healing spell is like 2 to 7 points. It's like a D6 plus 1. And so a 1 to 4 die isn't quite as powerful as a healing spell. So whatever system you're using, you can just sort of have that value and call it the binding wounds. And it only works on one character at the end of a combat. It's not a real strict rule. It's just like combat's done. These people are injured. The clerics are gonna bind wounds on these different players, but you can't like have 2 clerics binding wounds for 2d4s. It's just a one-shot deal. But it helps characters stay alive a little bit longer, especially at lower levels, where a couple, 1 to 4 points means a lot at a lower level, whereas when you're a 6th level fighter, it's not that big a deal. Trying to think of anything else. That's pretty much it, Just keep playing, have fun, play around a little bit, enjoy yourself. So hit that like and the subscribe. I always got to remind you of those two. And maybe next week, I'm going to talk about the old rules next week and why you should try them. Ciao.